on the outskirts of a forgotten English village, shrouded by ancient yews and the restless whisper of wind, stands the Wexley estate, a place where the past clings like ivy to crumbling stone. For generations, the Wexleys were a family of stature and secrets, their name spoken with a mixture of reverence and unease. But it is not their wealth, nor their eccentricities, that have kept their memory alive. It is the night the candles burned blue. They say that on a rain-lashed evening in 1897, the Wexley family gathered in their candlelit parlor for a séance, a final, desperate attempt to pierce the veil between the living and the dead. The air was thick with grief and longing, the kind that seeps into the bones and refuses to let go. As midnight approached, the flames of the candles, dozens of them, arranged in a trembling circle, shifted from gold to an unnatural, ghostly blue. And by dawn, the Wexley line was extinguished, their legacy swallowed by darkness and rumor. What truly happened that night? Was it madness, a trick of the mind, or something far more sinister? The villagers still whisper that the estate is cursed, that the blue flames were a sign of warning from the other side. But the truth, as always, is more elusive, more chilling than any fireside tale. Tonight, we will walk the shadowed halls of the Wexley estate, sift through the ashes of history, and confront the mystery that ended a family line. Are you prepared to question what you believe about the supernatural? Because once you see the blue flames, you may never look at candlelight the same way again. In the waning years of the 19th century, the English countryside was a patchwork of mist-laden fields and ancient woodlands, where the past seemed to linger in every hedgerow and hollow. It was here, beyond the reach of the city's relentless progress, that the Wexley estate stood, a sprawling manor of weathered stone and leaded glass. Perched atop a low hill, like a watchful sentinel, the drive to the house wound through a tunnel of yew trees, their branches so thick and gnarled that even sunlight struggled to break through. Visitors often remarked on the hush that fell as they approached, a silence so profound it seemed to press against the skin. The estate itself was a marvel of Victorian ambition, its facade, a tapestry of turrets, gables, and ornate carvings that hinted at both wealth and a certain restless imagination. Ivy crept up the walls in tangled profusion, and the gardens once the pride of the county had grown wild and unruly, as if nature herself was reclaiming what had been borrowed. At night, the house loomed against the sky, its windows flickering with candlelight, casting long, uncertain shadows across the lawns. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper, mingling with the faint trace of lavender from the sachets tucked into every drawer. The halls were lined with ancestral portraits, their eyes following every movement with a gaze that was equal parts pride and warning. The drawing rooms were filled with curiosities, cabinets of rare minerals, shelves of leather-bound tomes, and glass domes encasing delicate taxidermy birds. Every object seemed to whisper of stories half told, of secrets kept just out of reach. The Wexleys themselves were a family of contradictions. In public, they were the very image of Victorian respectability. Lewis Wexley, the stern but generous patriarch, presided over village affairs with a steady hand, while his wife, Lillian, hosted charity teas and garden parties that drew the county's elite. Their children, impeccably dressed and well-mannered, were educated at the finest schools. The family pew at St. Agnes was always filled, their voices rising in hymn each Sunday, their presence a reassuring constant in the village's social fabric. Yet behind the estate's heavy doors, the Wexleys indulged in passions and peculiarities that set them apart. Elias, for all his rational airs, was a collector of arcane texts and a dabbler in the sciences that skirted the edge of the forbidden. Lillian, delicate and prone to feigning spells, kept a private journal filled with dreams and omens, convinced that the dead spoke to her in the quiet hours before dawn. The children, too, were marked by the house's peculiar atmosphere, imaginative, and drawn to the shadows that pooled in the corners of their nursery. It was an age intoxicated by the unknown. Across England, séances and spirit boards were the fashion of the day, a genteel rebellion against the cold certainties of science. The Society for Psychical Research counted lords and ladies among its members, and newspapers breathlessly reported on ghostly visitations and messages from beyond. In drawing rooms from London to Liverpool, the veil between worlds seemed thinner than ever, and the promise of contact with the departed was both a comfort and a thrill. For the Wexleys, spiritualism was more than a parlor game, it was a lifeline. The family had known loss, as all families do, but their grief was a living thing, woven into the fabric of their days. The death of Elias's brother in a distant colonial war, the loss of Lillian's first child to fever, the slow decline of fortunes that left the estate a little more faded each year, all these sorrows pressed in, silent and insistent. The idea that the dead might linger, that they might offer guidance or solace, was a balm too tempting to resist. And so, as the century drew to a close and the world outside marched toward modernity, the Wexley estate remained a sanctuary for old beliefs and new anxieties, where the boundaries between respectability and eccentricity, between the living and the dead, were as blurred as the candlelit shadows on the walls. It was here, in this house of secrets and longing, that the stage was set for a night that would echo through history, a night when the candles burned blue, and nothing would ever be the same. At the heart of the Wexley estate's labyrinthine halls and echoing chambers was a family bound together by blood, grief, and a longing that none could name. Each member of the Wexley family carried their own burdens, their own secrets, and as the fateful night approached, the cracks in their carefully maintained facade began to widen. Elias Wexley, the patriarch, was a man of contradictions. In public, he was the embodiment of Victorian rationality, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and a gaze that could quell dissent in a parish meeting with a single glance. He managed the estate's dwindling fortunes with a meticulous hand, his ledgers as precise as his speech. Yet behind closed doors, Elias was haunted by a restlessness he could not explain. The death of his younger brother, lost to a fever in the jungles of Burma, had left a wound that never healed. Elias sought solace in the study of forbidden sciences, poring over treatises on mesmerism and the occult by candlelight. Searching for a logic that could explain the inexplicable, he was a man who believed in order, yet was drawn inexorably to chaos. Lillian Wexley, his wife, was the estate's fragile heart. Once the belle of county balls, Lillian's beauty had faded into a delicate pallor, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She moved through the house like a ghost, her presence marked by the faint scent of violets and the soft rustle of silk. Lillian's mind was a garden overgrown with memories and premonitions. She kept a diary filled with dreams, some beautiful, some terrifying, and believed, with a conviction that bordered on obsession, that her lost child still lingered in the nursery's shadows. Lillian's grief was a living thing, and it made her vulnerable to the promises of spiritualism, to the hope that the veil between worlds might be thinner than it seemed. Their children, to bore the weight of the family's history. The eldest, Henry, was a young man on the cusp of adulthood. His features a mirror of his father's, but his temperament far more volatile. Henry was restless, prone to fits of melancholy and sudden bursts of laughter that unsettled the servants. He spent hours in the estate's library, devouring tales of adventure and the supernatural, desperate to escape the suffocating expectations of his lineage. Beneath his bravado, Henry was haunted by a sense of doom he could not shake, a feeling that the family's fate was already written. Clara, the middle child, was the family's secret keeper. Quiet and observant, she moved through the house with the grace of a shadow, listening at keyholes and watching from behind half-closed doors. Clara's intelligence was sharp, her wit even sharper, but she was plagued by a sense of invisibility, of being overlooked in favor of her brother's drama and her mother's fragility. She found solace in the company of animals and in the pages of her sketchbook, where she drew the faces of the dead from memory and imagination alike. Clara's empathy was her gift and her curse. She felt the pain of others as keenly as her own. The youngest, Edward, was a child of silences. Pale and sickly, he spent most of his days in bed, his body racked by a mysterious illness that no doctor could name. Edward's world was confined to the nursery and the view from his window, where he watched the seasons change and the crows gather in the yew trees. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were often unsettling fragments of dreams, snatches of conversation he could not have overheard. The family whispered that Edward was touched, that he saw things others could not. Into this fragile constellation stepped Madame Rosina, the medium whose reputation had spread across counties like wildfire. She arrived at the Wexley estate on a rain-soaked afternoon, her carriage drawn by black horses and her eyes hidden behind a veil of Spanish lace. Madame Rosina was a woman of indeterminate age, her accent a shifting blend of Europe's borderlands. She carried with her an air of mystery, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and a collection of talismans and relics that she claimed could open doors between worlds. To some, she was a charlatan. To others, a prophetess. To the Wexleys, she was a last hope. Rosina's presence unsettled the household from the moment she crossed the threshold. The servants whispered about her strange rituals and the way the candles seemed to flicker in her wake. Elias regarded her with skepticism, yet found himself drawn to her knowledge of forbidden things. Lillian clung to her every word, desperate for a message from the other side. The children watched her with a mixture of fear and fascination, sensing that she was both a key and a catalyst. As the night of the séance approached, the Wexley family's vulnerabilities became ever more pronounced. Elias's need for control, Lillian's yearning for connection, Henry's fear of destiny, Clara's hunger for truth, Edward's otherworldly visions. All these threads would be drawn tight by Madame Rosina's hand. In their search for answers, the Wexleys would find themselves standing at the edge of an abyss, their fates bound together by grief, hope, and the promise of blue candlelight. The days leading up to the séance unfolded with a mounting sense of unease, as if the very air within the Wexley estate had thickened, heavy with anticipation and dread. It began with small disturban-sized doors left ajar that no one remembered, opening, the faint scent of smoke, in rooms where no fire had burned. The persistent feeling of being watched from the shadows. The servants, already wary of the family's eccentricities, whispered of cold spots in the corridors and the sound of footsteps echoing in the dead of night. Some claimed to have seen a pale figure drifting through the gardens at dusk, her face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. Lillian was the first to sense that something was amiss. Her dreams grew more vivid, more insistent, filled with the cries of her lost child and the distant tolling of bells. She awoke each morning with a sense of foreboding, her hands trembling as she poured her tea. She confided in Clara, who listened, with wide, solemn eyes, and in Madame Rosina, whose arrival seemed to coincide with the quickening of these strange events. Lillian began to believe that the veil between worlds was thinning, that the dead were reaching out to her with urgent messages. Elias, ever the skeptic, dismissed these occurrences as the products of overwrought nerves and the isolation of country life. Yet even he could not ignore the growing tension within the household. The estate's finances were in disarray, and creditors' letters arrived with increasing frequency. The crops had failed for a second year, and the villagers, once deferential, now eyed the Wexleys with suspicion. Elias found himself plagued by headaches and a sense of restlessness that drove him to pace the halls late into the night, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Henry, meanwhile, grew more agitated with each passing day. He claimed to hear voices whispering his name from the darkness. And once, while exploring the attic, he discovered a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon, letters written in a hand he did not recognize, filled with cryptic warnings and pleas for forgiveness. He confronted his father, who dismissed the letters as the ramblings of a distant ancestor, but Henry was not convinced. He began to suspect that the family's troubles were rooted in sins long buried, that the past was clawing its way to the surface. Clara, ever observant, noticed the subtle changes in the household's rhythm. The maids crossed themselves before entering certain rooms, and the butler, a man not given to superstition, refused to wind the grandfather clock after midnight. Clara took to carrying a small notebook, recording every odd occurrence, the flickering of the gaslights, the sudden chill in the nursery, the way Edward's eyes seemed to follow invisible figures across the ceiling. She confided her fears to Madame Rosina, who listened with grave attention and offered cryptic reassurances. Edward, for his part, became more withdrawn. He spent hours staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation. He spoke of visitors who came to him in the night, shadowy figures who whispered secrets in a language he could not understand. When Lillian pressed him for details, he simply shook his head and retreated further into silence. It was Madame Rosina who first suggested the séance. She gathered the family in the drawing room one evening, her voice low and urgent. "There is a presence here," she intoned, her eyes glinting in the candlelight, "a spirit that seeks to be heard. If we do not listen, it will not rest." She spoke of unfinished business, of messages from beyond, and of the dangers of ignoring the dead. Her words struck a chord with Lillian, who clung to the hope of hearing from her lost child, and with Henry, who was desperate for answers to the mysteries he had uncovered. Elias resisted at first, insisting that such rituals were the province of charlatans and fools. But the pressure from his family, combined with his own growing sense of helplessness, wore him down. He agreed to the séance, on the condition that it be conducted with dignity and respect, and that Madame Rosina take full responsibility for whatever might occur. The date was set for the night of the new moon, when the sky would be at its darkest and the boundary between worlds at its thinnest. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew taut with expectation. Madame Rosina prepared the drawing room, arranging the furniture in a circle and instructing the servants to procure a special set of candles, pure beeswax. She insisted, and dyed a deep indigo blue. She claimed that blue flames were a sign of true spiritual presence, a rare and powerful phenomenon. On the eve of the séance, a storm rolled in from the coast, lashing the estate with wind and rain. The family gathered in the drawing room, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes flickering with hope and fear. The candles were lit, their flames trembling in the draught. Madame Rosina took her place at the head of the circle, her hands adorned with rings that glinted in the gloom. As the clock struck midnight, a hush fell over the room. The air seemed to thicken, and the shadows pressed in closer. Madame Rosina began to chant in a language none of them recognized, her voice rising and falling like the wind outside. The flames of the candles flickered, then steadied, burning with an eerie blue light. In that moment, each member of the Wexley family felt the weight of their secrets, their grief, and their longing. They had come seeking answers, but as the séance began, a darker question lingered in the air. What price would they pay for the truth? And as the blue flames danced, it became clear that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The drawing room, once a place of laughter and music, had been transformed into a sanctum of shadows. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the storm, muffling the thunder and sealing the family in a world apart. The only light came from the circle of candles 12, and all arranged with ritual precision upon the polished table. Their flames wavered, casting elongated shapes that danced across the walls and ceiling, making the familiar room seem suddenly vast and strange. The Wexleys took their places in silence, each drawn by a different hope, a different fear. Elias sat at the head of the table, his jaw set, hands folded tightly in his lap. He watched Madame Rosina with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity, his mind racing with questions he would never voice aloud. Lillian, pale and trembling, clung to his side, her eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight as if searching for a sign. Henry slouched in his chair, arms crossed, his bravado a thin mask for the anxiety that gnawed at him. Clara, notebook forgotten, sat rigid and alert, her gaze darting from face to face, cataloging every detail. Edward, swaddled in a blanket, was so still he seemed almost part of the furniture, his wide eyes reflecting the flames. Madame Rosina presided over the gathering with an air of solemn authority. She wore a gown of midnight blue, her hair coiled in a crown of braids, her fingers heavy with rings of jet and silver. She moved with deliberate grace, her every gesture imbued with meaning. As she took her seat, she surveyed the family, her eyes lingering on each in turn, as if weighing their souls. "We are gathered," she intoned, her voice low and resonant. To seek that which is hidden, to call forth that which lingers in the shadows. If any among you doubts, let them speak now, for the spirits are drawn to truth and repelled by mockery. A tense silence followed. Elias cleared his throat, but said nothing. Henry smirked, but the sound died in his throat. Lillian's lips moved in silent prayer. Only Edward, eyes fixed on the candles, seemed utterly unafraid. Rosina nodded, satisfied. Then let us begin. She instructed them to join hands, forming an unbroken circle. The touch of skin was electric. Clara's hand, cold and clammy in Henry's, Lillian's trembling in Elias's grasp. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with anticipation and the scent of beeswax. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, but within the circle, all was still. Rosina closed her eyes and began to chant, her words a lilting cadence that rose and fell like the tide. The language was unfamiliar, ancient, and it seemed to vibrate in the bones. The flames of the candles flickered in time with her voice, as if responding to some secret rhythm. The family sat in rapt silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Elias's mind raced with skepticism. He watched Rosina's every move, searching for sleight of hand, for any sign of trickery. He told himself it was all theater, a performance designed to prey on the vulnerable. Yet, as the minutes passed, he felt a strange pressure building in his chest, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Lillian, by contrast, surrendered herself to the ritual. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered the name of her lost child, her grief a raw wound. She felt the presence of something just beyond the veil, a warmth that brushed her cheek, like a mother's kiss. For the first time in years, she felt hope flicker within her. Henry oscillated between cynicism and fear. He squeezed Clara's hand too tightly, his pulse racing. He tried to recall the stories he'd read, debunkings, exposures, tales of fraud, but the atmosphere in the room was too charged, too real. He found himself holding his breath, waiting for anything to happen. Clara, ever the observer, watched Rosina's face for signs of strain or deception. She noted the way the medium's lips moved, the subtle tremor in her hands. Yet, as the chanting continued, Clara felt a coldness seep into her bones, a sense of being drawn into a current she could not resist. She glanced at Edward, who sat with eyes closed, lips moving in silent conversation with someone unseen. The room seemed to contract, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder, the candle flames elongated, their light turning strange and spectral. Rosina's voice grew louder, more urgent, her words tumbling over one another in a torrent. The table vibrated beneath their hands, a low hum that resonated in the marrow. Suddenly Rosina's eyes snapped open, her pupils wide and black. The chanting ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the sound of the storm. The family sat frozen, hands locked, breath held. Then, as if in answer to an unspoken command, the flames of the candles shifted. One by one, they flared, their golden light fading to a deep, unnatural blue. The color was mesmerizing, cold, electric, almost alive. The blue flames cast eerie shadows, painting the faces around the table in ghostly hues. A collective gasp escaped the family. Lillian sobbed, clutching Elias's hand. Henry's bravado crumbled, his eyes wide with terror. Clara shivered, her heart pounding. Edward smiled, a secret smile, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Madame," Rosina's voice, now barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. "They are here." In that instant, the boundary between worlds seemed to dissolve. The Wexleys, bound by blood and longing, sat suspended between hope and horror. The blue flames their only witness. And as the séance truly began, none could know what would be summoned or what price would be paid for daring to seek the truth. The blue flames flickered, casting the room in a spectral glow that seemed to warp the very air. For a moment, the Wexleys sat in stunned silence, each transfixed by the unnatural light. Then, as if a veil had been lifted, the atmosphere shifted at first, then unmistakable. The temperature dropped, breath fogging in the air, and the shadows along the walls began to move with a will of their own. Madame Rosina's eyes rolled back, her body swaying as if caught in an invisible current. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was layered, echoing, as though a chorus of voices spoke through her. "We are here, we are listening. Speak, and be judged." Lillian gasped, her grip on Ilias's hand tightening until her knuckles blanched. "Is it you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "My darling girl, is it truly you?" The blue flames danced higher, and a chill swept through the room. From the far corner, a faint, childlike giggle echoed, a sound so familiar and yet so impossibly distant that Lillian's composure shattered. She sobbed openly, pleading for forgiveness, for a sign, for anything to fill the void that had hollowed her heart. Elias, ever the skeptic, tried to pull his hand away, but found himself unable to break the circle. His rational mind warred with the evidence before him, the shifting shadows, the icy air, the voice that was and was not Rosina's. He stared at the medium, searching for the trick, the mechanism, the hidden accomplice. But Rosina's face was contorted in agony, sweat beading on her brow, her lips moving in silent conversation with the unseen. Henry's bravado collapsed entirely. He began to mutter, at first under his breath, then louder, his words tumbling out in a torrent. "It's not real. It's not real. It's just a trick. Just a trick." But even as he spoke, the room seemed to close in around him. The shadows lengthened, coiling around his chair, and the blue light painted his face with a mask of terror. He saw, or thought he saw, a figure standing behind his mother woman in a white dress, her face obscured by a veil of hair. The figure raised a hand, beckoning, and Henry screamed, the sound raw and animal. Clara, ever the observer, felt her own composure slipping. She watched as the faces of her family twisted in fear and anguish, as the blue flames cast grotesque shapes on the walls. She tried to focus, to record every detail, but her mind was flooded with images, her mother's diary, pages filled with frantic scrawl, her father's secret letters, hidden in the study, Edward's drawings, always of the same pale woman with hollow eyes. Clara's heart pounded as she realized that the boundaries between memory and reality, between the living and the dead, were dissolving before her eyes. Edward, silent until now, began to hum a lullaby, a tune Lillian used to sing in the nursery, long before grief had claimed her voice. The sound was haunting, discordant, and as he sang, the blue flames flared brighter. The shadows on the walls coalesced into shapes, faces, hands, reaching, pleading. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, as if the grave itself had opened beneath their feet. Madame Rosina's body convulsed, her hands clawing at the table. Her voice shifted again, deeper now, almost masculine. "Confess," it demanded. "Confess, and be free." The command reverberated through the room, and one by one, the family's secrets began to spill forth. Elias, his voice shaking, admitted to forging documents to save the estate, to betraying the trust of those who depended on him. "I did it for us," he choked, tears streaming down his face. "I did it because I was afraid of losing everything, afraid of being nothing." Lillian, her face streaked with tears, confessed to wishing for death, to praying that her suffering would end, even if it meant leaving her children behind. "I am so tired," she wept, "so tired of the silence, the emptiness. I just wanted peace." Henry, sobbing, revealed the truth behind the letters. He had found their family's legacy was not one of honor, but of betrayal and violence. "We are cursed," he cried. "Cursed by the sins of our fathers, doomed to repeat their mistakes." Clara's voice, barely above a whisper, admitted to spying on her family, to keeping secrets she could not understand. "I wanted to know the truth," she said, "but now I wish I could forget." Edward's confession was the most chilling of all. He spoke in a voice not entirely his own, his eyes unfocused. "She comes for us," he intoned. "She waits in the dark. She is hungry, and she will not be denied." As the confessions poured forth, the room seemed to pulse with energy. The blue flames burned higher, casting the family's faces in ghastly relief. The shadows writhed, growing bolder, reaching across the table with grasping hands. The air was filled with whispers, fragments of conversation, snatches of song, the echo of footsteps on distant floors. Madame Rosina's role became ever more ambiguous. Was she a conduit, a victim, or something else entirely? Her body shook with the force of the spirits, her eyes rolling wildly. At times, she seemed to be fighting against the voices. At others, she surrendered completely, her mouth forming words she could not possibly know. The family's terror mounted as it became clear that Rosina was no longer in control if she ever had been. The séance spiraled further into chaos. The table rattled violently, the candles guttered and flared, and the shadows pressed in until it felt as if the room itself was shrinking, suffocating. The family clung to one another, their circle now a lifeline in a sea of darkness. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the air. Lillian, her eyes wide with terror, pointed to the far corner of the room. There, in the blue-lit gloom, stood the apparition of a young girl, her dress stained with mud, her eyes hollow and accusing. The figure raised a hand, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered, their blue flames wavering, as if in fear. Elias tried to speak, to reason, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of whispers. Henry collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara covered her ears, desperate to block out the voices. Edward stared at the apparition, his lips moving in silent conversation. Madame Rosina, her strength failing, slumped forward, her head striking the table with a dull thud. The circle was broken. The blue flames flared one final time, then guttered out, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, the Wexleys were left alone with their secrets, their grief, and the lingering presence of something that had crossed a threshold. The séance was over, but the horror had only just begun. The darkness that followed the extinguishing of the blue flames was absolute, a suffocating void that seemed to swallow sound, light, and reason itself. For a moment, the Wexleys sat frozen, their hands still reaching for one another in the blackness, hearts pounding in their chests. Then, as if released from a spell, the room erupted into chaos. Lillian was the first to move, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled from her chair, arms outstretched, calling for her lost child. Her voice echoed through the halls, desperate and wild, as she vanished into the shadows beyond the drawing room. Elias called after her, but his words were swallowed by the storm raging outside, and the storm now raging within the house. He fumbled for a candle, his hands shaking, but the matches would not catch. The darkness pressed in, thick and impenetrable. Henry, still on the floor, crawled toward the door, his mind fractured by what he had seen. He muttered to himself, fragments of confession and denial tumbling from his lips. It wasn't real. It can't be real. We're not cursed. We're not. But the memory of the apparition, the accusing eyes of the girl, haunted him. He saw her everywhere, in the flash of lightning at the window, in the shifting shadows on the walls. He pressed his back against the cold stone, sobbing, as the house seemed to close in around him. Clara, trembling, tried to gather her scattered thoughts. She clung to her notebook, the pages now smeared and torn, as if the act of writing could anchor her to reality. She called for Edward, her voice thin and wavering, but there was no answer. Panic rising, she searched the room, her hands brushing against overturned chairs and shattered glass. The air was thick with the scent of wax and fear. Edward was gone. The realization struck Clara like a blow. She ran from the drawing room, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble floors, calling his name. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth, every corridor unfamiliar, every door leading deeper into darkness. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their painted eyes glinting with secrets. She thought she heard Edward's voice, faint and distant, singing the lullaby from the séance. She followed the sound, her heart pounding, but it always seemed just out of reach. Elias, torn between searching for Lillian and protecting his remaining children, was paralyzed by indecision. He clung to reason, to the belief that there must be an explanation, a trick of the light, a collective hysteria, something he could understand and control. But the evidence of his senses betrayed him. The house was alive with whispers, with footsteps that echoed from empty rooms, with doors that slammed shut of their own accord. He found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. Madame Rosina, slumped over the table, began to stir. Her breathing was shallow, her face ashen. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were clouded with confusion and terror. She looked at Elias, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I warned you. Some doors should never be opened." Then she collapsed again, her body racked with shivers. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing the windows, wind howling through the eaves. The estate, once a symbol of stability and order, now seemed besieged by forces beyond comprehension. The servants, sensing the madness within, had locked themselves in the kitchen, refusing to venture into the main house. They crossed themselves and whispered prayers, convinced that the Wexleys had brought a curse upon them all. As the night wore on, the boundaries between reason and superstition blurred. Elias, desperate to restore order, searched the house by the flickering light of a single candle. He found Lillian in the nursery, rocking an empty cradle, her eyes glazed and unseeing. She spoke to the air, her words a jumble of lullabies and apologies. Elias knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, but she did not seem to recognize him. He tried to lead her away, but she clung to the cradle, her fingers digging into the wood. Henry, lost in the maze of corridors, was haunted by visions. He saw the faces of ancestors he had only known from portraits, their mouths twisted in silent screams. He heard the echo of his own confessions, the weight of family secrets pressing down on him. In a moment of clarity, he realized that the curse was not some external force, but the legacy of guilt and betrayal, passed down through generations. He stumbled into the library, searching for the letters he had found, desperate for answers. But the letters were gone, replaced by pages of blank, yellowed paper. Clara, still searching for Edward, found herself drawn to the old chapel at the edge of the estate. The door creaked open, revealing a space lit by the faint glow of moonlight through stained glass. She saw Edward kneeling at the altar, his hands folded in prayer, his lips moving in silent supplication. Clara approached, her heart aching with relief and fear. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his frail shoulders. Edward looked up at her, his eyes filled with a strange serenity. "She's here," he whispered. "She's waiting for us." Clara shivered, feeling the presence in the room a cold, watchful gaze that seemed to emanate from the shadows. She pulled Edward to his feet, determined to bring him back to the safety of the house. But as they stepped into the corridor, the door slammed shut behind them, and the sound echoed through the empty halls. Back in the drawing room, Madame Rosina regained consciousness. She rose unsteadily, her movements slow and deliberate. She gathered her belongings, her cards, her crystals, her vials of scented oil and prepared to leave. But as she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the knob. She turned back, her eyes meeting Elias's. "You must finish what you started," she said, "or the house will never be free." Elias, exhausted and broken, realized that the only way to end the nightmare was to confront the truth, to face the family's secrets, to acknowledge the pain they had tried so hard to bury. He gathered his family, Lillian, still lost in her grief, Henry, trembling and hollow-eyed, Clara and Edward, clinging to each other, and led them back to the drawing room. The candles were relit, their flames now steady and white. In that moment, the contrast between love and betrayal, reason and superstition, was laid bare. The Wexleys, for all their faults, were bound together by blood and by the choices they had made. The house, once a fortress, had become a crucible, place where the past could no longer be denied. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside. The first light crept through the windows, illuminating the faces of the family as they sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down upon them. The estate, battered but still standing, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But the scars of the night would never fully heal. The Wexleys had glimpsed the darkness at the heart of their legacy, and nothing would ever be the same. The line between reason and superstition, love and betrayal, had been crossed, and the echoes of that night would haunt the estate for generations to come. The first pale light of dawn crept across the battered estate. But within the Wexley house, the night's horrors had not yet loosened their grip. The family, huddled together in the drawing room, looked less like survivors and more like specters, themselves faces gaunt, eyes hollow, hands trembling as they clung to one another and to the last shreds of hope. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. Elias sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the guttering candles. He had always believed himself a man of reason, a bulwark against the chaos of the world, but now he felt as if he were staring into an abyss that reason could not bridge. The events of the night had stripped him bare, exposing every fear, every failure. He looked at his family, Lillian, lost in a fog of grief, Henry, shivering and silent, Clara, her face streaked with tears, Edward, pale and distant-tanned, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. He had brought them to this point, and now he must see it through. Lillian sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused. She rocked gently, humming the lullaby that had haunted the séance, her voice thin and wavering. The loss of her child, the years of silent suffering, the terror of the night all, had fused into a single, unending ache. She seemed barely aware of her surroundings, mind drifting between worlds, searching for a peace that remained forever out of reach. Henry, once so full of restless energy, was now a shadow of himself. He stared at the floor, lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps an apology. The revelations of the night, the family's sins, the curse that clung to their name, had broken something inside him. He could not meet his father's eyes, nor his own, in the reflection of the window. He was haunted by the vision of the girl, by the knowledge that some legacies cannot be outrun. Clara, always the observer, had become the anchor for what remained of the family. She moved quietly among them, offering comfort where she could, her own fear masked by a determination that bordered on desperation. She had found Edward, had brought him back from the chapel, but she could not shake the feeling that something had followed them, something that lingered in the corners of the room, watching, waiting. Edward sat apart, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the dying flames. He seemed calm, almost serene, but there was a distance in his gaze, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. Occasionally, he would murmur a word or phrase, "She's here," or "It's almost time," and each time, a chill would pass through the room. As the hour grew late, Madame Rosina returned. She entered the drawing room with slow, deliberate steps, her face drawn and pale. She looked at each member of the family in turn, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to age her by decades. She spoke softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The spirits are restless. The truth must be spoken, or the house will never know peace." Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. He rose to his feet, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "We have lived in the shadow of secrets for too long. If there is a curse on this family, it is one of our own making. We must face it, together, or be consumed by it." He turned to Lillian, taking her hands in his. "Forgive me," he said, his voice breaking, "for all the things I could not protect you from, for the things I did in the name of love, and the things I failed to do out of fear." Lillian looked up at him, her eyes clearing for a moment. She squeezed his hands, a single tear tracing down her cheek. "We all carry our ghosts, Elias, but we do not have to let them rule us." Henry, voice trembling, confessed his own guilt. "I tried to run from the past, to bury it, but it followed me, followed all of us. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Clara stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "We are more than our secrets. We are more than our pain. If there is a curse, let it end with us. Let us be the last to carry it." Edward, still staring at the candles, spoke in a voice that was not entirely his own. "She is waiting. She wants to be free. We must let her go." At that moment, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles, which had burned low and steady, suddenly flared with blue light, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. The shadows deepened, swirling around the family, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with the scent of earth and lilies, the unmistakable perfume of the grave. A figure appeared in the doorway, a young girl, her dress tattered and stained, her eyes wide and sorrowful. She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the floor. The family watched in terror and awe as she approached the table, her gaze fixed on Edward. Edward rose to meet her, his face calm. He reached out a hand, and the girl took it. For a moment, the room was filled with a blinding blue light, so intense that the family shielded their eyes. When the light faded, the girl was gone, and Edward lay motionless on the floor. Lillian rushed to his side, cradling him in her arms, her cries echoing through the house. Elias knelt beside her, his face etched with grief. Henry and Clara stood, together, holding each other, tears streaming down their faces. Madame Rosina bowed her head, her voice trembling. The debt is paid, the line is ended, the house is free. As the sun rose, its light spilling through the windows, the Wexley family gathered around Edward's body. They wept for him, for themselves, for all that had been lost. The curse, whatever its nature, had claimed its final price. The estate, once filled with life and laughter, was now silent. The Wexley line, so proud and so haunted, was extinguished. The blue flames had burned away the last of their secrets, leaving only ashes and memory. Outside, the world moved on. The villagers would whisper of the night the candles burned blue, of the family that vanished, of the house that stood empty on the hill. But within those walls, the final hours had played out a reckoning, a release, and the end of a legacy that had been written in sorrow and sealed in flame. In the days that followed, the Wexley estate became a place of silence and shadow. The once grand halls, echoing with the laughter and footsteps of generations, now stood empty, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The villagers, who had always regarded the family with a mixture of envy and suspicion, watched from a distance as the last of the servants packed their belongings and slipped away before dawn, eager to leave the haunted house behind. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do in small villages. Some said the Wexleys had been cursed for dabbling in forbidden arts, that the blue flames were a sign of the devil's work. Others whispered that the family had simply gone mad, driven to ruin by grief and guilt. A few, more charitable, spoke of tragedy, a family undone by sorrow, their hearts broken by loss. But no one dared approach the estate, not even the bravest boys who once dared each other to steal apples from the orchard. The house on the hill became a forbidden place, a cautionary tale told in hushed voices by candlelight. The estate itself seemed to mourn. The gardens, once meticulously tended, grew wild and tangled, the roses choking the paths and the yew trees casting ever deeper shadows. The windows, left unwashed, clouded over with dust and cobwebs. The great front doors, once thrown open to welcome guests, remained firmly shut, their iron hinges rusting in the damp air. On stormy nights, villagers claimed to see a pale blue glow flickering behind the curtains, and to hear the faint strains of a lullaby drifting on the wind. For those who had known the Wexleys, the scars ran deep. The vicar, who had baptized the children and presided over family weddings, found himself unable to speak of them without a tremor in his voice. The housekeeper, who had served Lillian since girlhood, wept quietly as she packed away the last of the family's belongings, her hands lingering on a child's forgotten toy, a faded photograph, a diary filled with dreams and regrets. Even the villagers, who had never set foot inside the estate, felt the loss, a sense that something vital had been extinguished, leaving only emptiness in its wake. The psychological wounds were slow to heal. Those who had witnessed the family's decline, who had seen Lillian wandering the village in her nightdress, or heard Henry's anguished cries in the dead of night, found themselves haunted by memories they could not escape. Some dreamed of blue flames and shadowy figures, of voices calling from the darkness. Others avoided the estate altogether, crossing themselves as they passed, unwilling to tempt whatever fate had claimed the Wexleys. Yet, as the months turned to years, the line between tragedy and curse began to blur. The story of the night the candles burned blue became legend, embroidered with each retelling. Some insisted that the family's ghosts still roamed the halls, seeking peace they would never find. Others claimed that the estate itself was alive, feeding on sorrow and fear, waiting for the next family, foolish enough to cross its threshold. The truth, as always, was elusive, hidden in the spaces between memory and myth, between what was seen and what was believed. For the Wexleys, there was no redemption, no second chance. Their legacy was written in the silence of empty rooms, in the wild tangle of the gardens, in the blue glow that sometimes flickered in the night. The estate stood as a monument to their suffering, a reminder that some wounds run too deep to heal, that some secrets are better left undisturbed. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the EUs and the moon cast its pale light over the abandoned house, there was a sense of release, a feeling that, at last, the restless spirits had found peace. The curse, if it had ever existed, was spent. The tragedy remained, but it was softened by time, by the gentle forgetting that comes with the turning of the seasons. The villagers moved on, their lives shaped by new joys and new sorrows. The estate faded into the background, a shadow on the hill, its story told only by those who remembered. But for those who had witnessed the night the candles burned blue, the memory lingered, a reminder of the thin line between love and loss, between reason and superstition, between tragedy and curse. What truly happened on the night the candles burned blue? Was it the final unraveling of a family already frayed by grief and secrets? Or did something cross the threshold of the Wexley estates, something that defies explanation? In the aftermath, we are left with more questions than answers. And perhaps that is the nature of all great mysteries, to haunt us, to linger in the corners of our minds, to remind us of the limits of what we know. The story of the Wexleys is, at its heart, a meditation on belief and obsession. In their desperate longing to reach across the veil, to find solace in the voices of the dead, they became prisoners of their own yearning. How often do we, too, seek meaning in the inexplicable, comfort in rituals that promise to bridge the gap between loss and hope? The line between faith and delusion is perilously thin, and the Wexleys walked it until it gave way beneath them. Obsession, like a shadow, can grow in the absence of light. For Elias, it was the need to control the uncontrollable. For Lillian, the ache to reclaim what was lost. For Henry and Clara, the hunger for truth, no matter the cost. Each was driven by love, by fear, by the unspoken wounds that festered in silence. But when obsession becomes the lens through which we see the world, reality itself can warp, and the monsters we fear may be of our own making. And yet, there are moments in the Wexley tale that resist easy explanation. The blue flames, the apparitions, the voices that spoke through Madame Rosino, were these the products of a collective hysteria, the final collapse of fragile minds? Or did the family, in their grief and longing, open a door that should have remained closed? Was the curse real, or was it the weight of guilt and sorrow passed down through generations? Perhaps the greatest horror is not what we see, but what we cannot know. The unknown is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and desires. The Wexley's tragedy invites us to ask, what would we risk for a glimpse beyond the veil? What secrets would we confess if we believed the dead were listening? And if the candles burned blue in our own homes, would we dare to look into the shadows, or would we turn away? Now, I turn the question to you. Was it madness, manipulation, or something truly supernatural that ended the Wexley line? What do you believe happened that night? Share your theories, your doubts, your own stories of the unexplained in the comments below. After all, every legend begins with a question, and sometimes the answers are waiting in the dark. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of the Wexley estate, where grief, secrets, and the unknown converged on a single, unforgettable night. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who isn't afraid to peer into the darkness and ask the questions most would rather leave unspoken. I hope the story of the night the candles burned blue has left you with chills and perhaps a few questions of your own. If you found yourself drawn into the mystery, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel is a gathering place for those who crave the strange, the unsettling, and the stories that linger long after the last candle has burned out. Your thoughts and theories are what make this community so unique. so please share them in the comments below. What do you think truly happened to the Wexleys? Was it a curse, a tragedy, or something that defies explanation? And if you're hungry for more, you won't want to miss our next episode, where we'll descend even deeper into the forgotten corners of history, a tale of madness, mirrors, and a house that remembers every secret ever whispered within its walls. Trust me, you won't want to look away. Before you go, I'll leave you with one final question. What would you do if the candles burned blue in your home? Would you dare to stay and seek the truth, or would you run from whatever waits in the shadows? Let me know below you're brave enough. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and remember, some mysteries are meant to be solved, and some are meant to haunt us forever.